All right, let's jump right into this explainer and decode the biochemistry behind MK-677. This is a genuinely fascinating compound that sits right at the intersection of cellular signaling and physiological performance. Look, if you spent any time at all researching recovery, muscle preservation, or longevity, you've probably heard the name MK-677, or Ibutamoren thrown around. But instead of the usual locker room bro science, today we're going strictly off the clinical data and the molecular biology. We're going to break down exactly what this molecule is, how it literally hijacks your body's endocrine system, and what the clinical literature actually says about its effects on human physiology.
So here's the big question for anyone focused on their physique or athletic recovery. How does tricking the body's natural hunger receptors actually trigger an anabolic cascade? I mean, it sounds almost like science fiction, right? Taking a molecule that just mimics a stomach hormone to signal your brain to build and preserve muscle tissue. But as we'll see, the biological pathways here are very real, they're heavily researched, and honestly, they're incredibly potent.
To really get a grip on this, we're going to follow a micro to macro arc today. First, we'll meet MK-677, then dive into the ghrelin receptor mechanism and unpack the GH and IGF-1 axis. From there, we'll look at the real-world impacts on muscle, sleep, and bone, objectively weigh the biological side effects, and wrap up with dosing and comparisons.
Okay, Section 1. Meet MK-677, or Ibutamoren. The absolute most critical thing to understand right off the bat is that ibutamoren is not a hormone itself. It's not testosterone, and it's definitely not human growth hormone. It's actually a ghrelin receptor agonist. Now, ghrelin is a hunger-stimulating peptide hormone that's naturally produced mostly by your stomach. When your stomach is empty, it pumps out ghrelin, which travels up to your brain and binds to a very specific receptor called GHSR1A. MK-677 is basically a synthetic mimic that acts on that exact same receptor, effectively hijacking the hunger signal so it can communicate directly with your pituitary gland.
And what makes MK-677 so unique in the performance space is its actual molecular structure. It's an orally active, non-peptide compound. See, a lot of traditional growth hormone secretagogues or peptides require injections, because otherwise they'd just get destroyed by your stomach acid. But MK-677 survives digestion. Plus, it has an exceptionally long active window, a 24-hour half-life. That means it stays active in your system all day long from just a single dose.
Moving on to Section 2, the ghrelin receptor mechanism. So, when MK-677 actually binds to that GHSR1A receptor on the cell membrane, it sets off this crazy rapid chain reaction. Enzymes get activated, secondary messengers are deployed, and the ultimate endgame is pretty straightforward. This entire cascade triggers a massive release of intracellular calcium. That sudden flood of calcium depolarizes the cell and basically forces the pituitary gland to secrete human growth hormone. Now, this is huge if you're an athlete. Injected exogenous growth hormone creates this continuous artificial flood of hormones in the body, which can actually shut down your own natural production. MK-677 operates completely differently. It amplifies your natural pulsatile release of growth hormone. Your body already releases GH in pulses, mostly while you sleep. MK-677 just turns up the volume on those natural pulses, totally avoiding that continuous artificial bleed that messes up your intrinsic endocrine rhythms.
All right, let's jump to Section 3, the GH and IGF-1 axis.
To figure out what happens once all that growth hormone hits the bloodstream, we have to look at the clinical data. There was this landmark 1996 study by Chapman and colleagues, published in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism, where they gave healthy adults a 25 milligram daily dose of oral MK-677. Get this, it increased their mean 24-hour growth hormone concentrations by a staggering 97%. It practically doubled their total daily output of growth hormone just by amplifying those natural pre-existing pulses we talked about.
And when you look across diverse populations in the clinical data, you see these consistent, massive spikes. Healthy volunteers, GH-deficient adults, obese males, the literature shows major elevations in the GH axis across the board. But here's the so what for tissue repair. Once that growth hormone hits your liver, the liver converts it into IGF-1, or insulin-like growth factor 1. Growth hormone gets all the hype, sure, but IGF-1 is the ultimate downstream driver of skeletal muscle protein turnover, collagen synthesis, and systemic tissue repair. It's the real MVP here.
Which brings us nicely to Section 4, muscle, sleep, and bone.
Check out this fascinating study from 1998 by Murphy and colleagues. They put healthy volunteers on a brutal caloric restriction, just 18 kilocalories per kilogram of body weight a day. They were intentionally trying to induce catabolism, meaning muscle breakdown. And they found that MK-677 literally reverses diet-induced nitrogen wasting. In plain English for bodybuilders, reversing nitrogen wasting during a calorie deficit means MK-677 acts as this incredibly powerful anti-catabolic shield. It protects your hard-earned lean muscle mass when you're cutting hard and your body just wants to eat its own muscle for energy.
And backing that up, a 12-month randomized placebo-controlled trial by Nass and colleagues looked at healthy older adults. Over a full year on 25 milligrams of MK-677, these folks gained an average of 1.1 kilograms of fat-free mass, while the placebo group actually lost mass. The craziest part? This muscle accretion happened completely independently of any functional strength training. They weren't even lifting. The compound just shifted their body's metabolic environment to favor muscle preservation and growth.
You know, a massive component of all this recovery happens while you are completely unconscious. Roughly 60 to 70% of your daily growth hormone is naturally pumped out during your first deep, slow-wave sleep cycle. Because MK-677 amplifies natural pulses, it heavily targets this specific overnight window. Boosting this axis intensely supports overnight muscle protein turnover and connective tissue repair. It makes total sense why improved sleep architecture and wildly enhanced recovery are some of the most consistent things reported in the literature.
Okay, Section 5, Biological Side Effect Profile. Because we have to talk about the trade-offs.
Keeping this entirely objective, there's no free lunch in biology, right? The clinical data flags some very specific side effects that have to be managed. Because MK-677 mimics the hunger hormone, a transient and sometimes seriously intense increase in appetite is super common, though it usually fades. People also frequently report mild lower extremity edema, which is basically just water retention in the legs, along with occasional muscle pain. But the absolute biggest clinical flags relate to how it impacts your glucose metabolism.
Listen up, because in that same 12-month clinical trial by Nass, subjects actually saw their fasting blood glucose rise by an average of 5 milligrams per deciliter alongside a measurable drop in insulin sensitivity. For physique athletes, this is a massive data point. Elevating the growth hormone axis inherently pushes back against insulin sensitivity. It's a known class effect of all GH secretagogues. Meaning, if you're exploring this pathway, your metabolic context, like your baseline HbA1c and fasting glucose, is a non-negotiable metric to track. You absolutely cannot run these compounds blindly without monitoring your metabolic health.
Finally, let's wrap up with Section 6, Dosing and Comparisons.
When you look at the broader landscape of growth hormone stimulation, MK-677 usually gets compared to injectable peptides like Ibutamoren. Now, both compounds activate the exact same ghrelin receptor, but their pharmacokinetics are worlds apart. MK-677's non-peptide structure means it survives digestion and stimulates your pituitary for a full 24 hours. Peptides like Ibutamoren, on the other hand, require subcutaneous injections and have a super short half-life of around 2 hours. So they cause a rapid, acute spike in GH, rather than MK-677's all-day elevation.
As for the clinical dosing data, the research consensus across multiple human trials points to a 25 milligram daily dose as the standard for really robust IGF-1 elevation. At that dose, IGF-1 levels climb continuously, frequently restoring to young adult reference ranges within just 2 to 4 weeks. But, and I can't stress this enough, relying on this data means you have to accept the biological necessity of monitoring. You've got to establish a precise baseline for IGF-1, fasting glucose, and HbA1c to make absolutely sure the metabolic trade-offs aren't outweighing the anabolic benefits.
So it leaves us with a pretty profound thought to ponder. We've just spent this explainer decoding exactly how a non-peptide molecule can hijack a stomach receptor, signal the brain, and radically alter the human body's capacity to retain muscle and accelerate its own repair. If we can trick the body into preserving muscle and amplifying recovery just by mimicking a hunger hormone, what other physiological limits are we on the brink of rewriting? The science of cellular signaling is moving incredibly fast, and MK-677 is really just one window into the future of human performance.